Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you here for the second installment of this course on ritual reenactments, becoming Moshe, a mother, and a high priest in the Yamim, Noraim Tefillah with Rabbanit Leah, Sarna. We're thrilled to have everyone here as part of Drisha's Elul programming. We're running a number of courses throughout the month of Elul and during Aseret Yemei Tshuva. And so Rabbanit Sarna's course is one of those that we're really excited to be here for this evening. Rabbanit Sarna is our new Associate Education Director at Drisha. She previously served as the Director of Religious Engagement at Ashe Shalom B'nai Israel congregation in the Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. She was ordained at Yeshiva Maharat in 2018 and holds a BA from Yale University in Philosophy and Psychology, and has also trained at the Stella K. Abraham Beit Midrash for Women at Migdal Oz, has learned and taught previously at Drisha, as well as at the Center for Modern Torah Leadership. Tonight's class in our set of ritual reenactments and the ways that the liturgy asks us to step into certain roles and personae in moments of various prayers, tonight's session will focus on Talmudic and liturgical texts about the Shofar's cries, and particularly as those relate to mothers, as both criers and the ones who know cries the best. Mothers will be the focus here as we contemplate how the liturgy asks us to enact motherhood through what we are doing. It is great to see everyone here, but without further ado, Rabbanit Sarna, whenever you're ready, I think we can get started.
Yeah, hi everyone. So good to see you all here. And if you ever have any questions about active motherhood, you can just watch Kate and her kid on the big screen over here. So tonight we're going to be talking about how on Rosh Hashana we are called to enact motherhood. So last week, for those of you who joined us, thank you so much for coming back. Such a vote of confidence, and people will come back for round two. Last week we spoke about how the Slichot liturgy pushes us to step into the shoes of Moshe, return to the day in Moshe's life in which God revealed the 13 midot to Moshe, and how we're called to kind of step into that moment, step into Moshe's shoes, and then also make Moshe level kind of demands of God, which is obviously a very intense thing to do, but that the reenactment that our liturgy encourages or potentially even kind of forces should therefore give us the confidence to make Moshe-style demands of the Almighty, which is really like a really intense thing that our liturgy calls on us to do. So on Rosh Hashana, I would argue, we are called on to be mothers. Motherhood is a huge theme in the Rosh Hashana liturgy. Does anyone want to just call out your favorite parenthood, motherhood moment? And if you're a man listening to this, we will get to you in 1 second. But there is like a little bit of something gendered going on. Does anyone want to call out your favorite like motherhood themed thing in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy that comes to mind? If you want to unmute yourself, you can just hit your space bar and that will temporarily unmute you. Anyone have any thoughts? Otherwise, we'll just get to them in course.
We do have one. Ellen Lerman on Facebook Live wrote Hannah as her favorite example.
Great, 10 points to you, Hannah. We will get to that in the source sheet, but that is exactly right. We read as the Haftarah on the first day of Rosh Hashana. We read about Hannah in that Haftarah. Relatedly, does anyone have a recollection about what the Haftarah for the second day of Rosh Hashana is?
It's from Yirmiyahu.
And who is crying for her sons in Yirmiyahu?
Rachel.
Very good, right. So we have Rachel crying for her sons, Rachel mivakal baneha, on the second day. Very good. Okay, amazing. So now, there's one other thing that our liturgy describes as pregnant, or in the Rosh Hashana liturgy over and over again?
The birth of the world.
The world is pregnant,
Right.
or something is
Hayom
pregnant.
Harat Olam.
Right, so very confusing actually how all those words string together. Today the world is pregnant, today is the pregnancy of the world, today is the birth of the world. Who is pregnant with the world? If the world is itself pregnant, very, you could string those words together in a million different ways, but you definitely have this very strong pregnancy theme in the liturgy itself. And when do we say Hayom Harat Olam? Does anyone recall? What does that come after? It's actually a little bit of a trick question, but in general, where does that come after? It comes after the shofar, right? 3 times we say it after shofar. It's a little bit of a trick, which you'll see this year because we say it also on
Right, in between. You say it in between the sections.
Right. So right. So let's say you have machio, exactly. Then you say that, and then you blow shofar, and then you would say Hayom Harat Olam. Exactly. You say it also on. You say it even when you don't blow shofar because it's Shabbos, so that's why it's a little bit of like a trick. But it seems to be connected to shofar blowing, and you actually know that because we're going to talk about this today. I was trying to remember when we talked about this, and we haven't yet. But we'll see a source that talks about the custom to blow shofar during the silent Amidah, and in the silent Amidah, in communities where you blow shofar during the silent Amidah, we'll talk about how that works when we get there. You actually say Hayom Harat Olam in the silent Amidah, which you don't say if you don't blow shofar in the silent Amidah. So even though we say it even on days where we don't blow shofar, it's clearly connected to shofar because it gets added into the liturgy of the silent Amidah. If you're praying somewhere where they blow shofar during the silent Amidah. Anyways, okay, so those are all really good. There's one other person who we'll get to. She's not intuitive, but she's also very important. If anyone wants to call out one other mother who is connected to the Torah reading and to the day, if anyone wants to call it out, otherwise I'll just.
Is it Hagar?
Oh, so Hagar, for sure, she's in the Torah reading. And relatedly to Hagar, who else? Sarah, right? Her sister wife, her co-wife, Sarah, exactly. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so before we really dive in, I do want to say an aside for the men that I think motherhood is something that men can certainly practice as well. And we'll just, let me share my screen because I have some textual evidence for that, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so I meant to make this big. Make this bigger. In source 1, too big. All right. In source 1 over here, we have Moshe saying, Hanochi hariti et kol ha'am hazeh, im anochi yoladetihu. Right? Moshe says, did I conceive all these people? Did I bear them? Right? Hariti, hara. Was I pregnant with them? Did I give birth to them? Such that you would say to me, carry them in your bosom, kasher yisa ha'omin et hayonik, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land that you have promised. So here we have Moshe saying, using motherhood metaphors about himself, and asking God, did you make me the mother of these people? Which means that there's a conceptual world in which God would be like, yes. And that motherhood can in fact potentially at least be practiced by men, and so I want to argue that on Rosh Hashana, our liturgy and our haftarahs and our Torah readings all kind of leave open or push everyone, not just women, but also men, into the role of motherhood as a stance that is particularly important on this day. And so and also through shofar, right? And that shofar through Hayom Harat Olam is also kind of tapping into that. Okay, so let's actually start. I want to start with the piece about shofar that's actually a little bit less intuitive. So we're gonna look at two women vis-a-vis their relationship to shofar specifically. So this is our first one, and we're gonna look at a midrash vayikra rabbah. And here we have a somewhat well-known story from or somewhat well-known midrash. There's different versions of it, so I'll just tell you that in advance. So when you say this midrash, you'll be like, wait, I thought something else happened. So just know that there's different versions that are all quite similar, and I only put one in here because we're not giving a whole shiur about just this one midrash. But here's the midrash. So it's about our Torah reading on the second day of Rosh Hashana, which is about Akedat Yitzchak. And here you have the story of Abraham, Natal Yitzchak Beno. He took Yitzchak his son, Va'aleo Harim, V'oridok Va'od, and he took him up mountains and down into valleys. Haleo al Chad min Harim. You took him up onto one of the mountains. Uvanam Mizbeach, and he built an altar. V'sider Eitzim, and he organized wood. V'arach ma'aracha, and he prepared the whole sacrificial array. V'natalet hasakin l'shachto, and he took up the knife to slaughter his son. V'ilulei shekaro lo malach min hashamayim kvar haya nishkat, and if the angel hadn't called out from the heavens, he already would have been slaughtered. And this says the midrash, Tida shekain, you know this is the case, shechazar Yitzchak etzel imo, because Isaac went down off the mountain and he went to his mother. Now, everything until now was more or less in the Torah. We never see another conversation between Isaac and his mother in the Torah. So this part is all the midrash at its finest. So we have Isaac, he goes back to his mother. Va'amrala an hayitzbari, she says, where have you been, my son? Amrala netalani avi v'helani harim v'horidani va'od v'chulei. He says, my father took me and he took me up mountains and he took me down to valleys. Va'amra vai al bari derivata ilulei hamalach kvar hayita shachut. She says, woe to the son of a woman drunk. Let's hold on to that drunkenness, that midrashic motherhood drunkenness for a moment. Why hold on to the mother who is drunk with grief? If it were not for the angel, you would have been slaughtered already. Amar la in. And he says back to her, yes. And that time she screamed out 6 cries corresponding to 6 shofar blasts. Amru lo hispika hadavar ad shemeta. And they said, so the translation here says, no sooner had she done so than she died. I would actually say lo hispika means that she actually didn't finish it. The Mishnah says shofar, the minimum requirement for shofar is shalosh shel shalosh shalosh, which means 3 sets of tekiah, trua, tekiah. You have to do that 3 times, and that is in and of itself 3. Okay, shalosh shel shalosh shalosh. And so she only got through 6 cries, not 9, right? It's meant to be 3 times 3 is 9, and she only did 6, so she didn't finish calling out all of her shofar cries until she died. And that's the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarna. So this is not in the Torah, but here you have Midrash and Vayikra Rabbah, a relatively early Midrash, and you have the Midrash saying, what is the origin of shofar? Right? It never says explicitly shofar, but shisha kolot keneged shisha tkiot. It doesn't say tkiot shofar, but I think you're supposed to intuit tkiot shofar. And so therefore the Midrash is suggesting that Sarah is in some ways the origin of shofar. Obviously you have the ram itself, but she screams out like the shofar, like the ram's horn, and her cries are the shofar blasts, and she couldn't even finish them before she had to leave this world. So that, I mean, I think that's more or less the entire shiur in a nutshell. But I wanna provide more evidence to this idea that the shofar is actually a performance of motherhood. So not only is it reenacting Sarah in this moment of hearing that her son was in this horrible situation, this moment of teetering between life and death. So that's the other piece of this that I want us to hold on to, is it's not just any moment of motherhood. It's a moment of motherhood in which there's great risk. So the great risk of my son was about to be killed by my husband, let's say, and which honestly, like, I don't know how you recover from that. So in some ways, like, that makes a lot of sense in this narrative that Sarah then dies. We never hear her kind of confronting Abraham about it, or potentially she couldn't even have considered that. But so let's hold on to that, because we're going to see that again, that exact theme of women crying out in these like life death moments, vis-a-vis their children. Okay. So now we're not gonna read all this, but this is this moment. This is from the Haftarah. This is the story of Hannah, and as was intuited in the, I forget who you said it was, but in the Facebook chat. So I'm so glad you're watching and participating. So here we have Hannah. She is childless, and she gets up and she goes with her husband to Shiloh, where the Mishkan is, and she goes in, and Vihi Marat Nafesh, and she's extremely wretched. V'tzipalel Hashem uvacho tivkeh. She prays to God and she cries. We have a lot of crying in this language of Hannah, and we have also some of these classic lines where we learn about even how to daven from Hannah. So that's here. V'Hannah hi medaberet al liba rak sifateha naot v'kola lo yishamea. Right. So her lips move, but you can't hear any voice from her. And Eli then thinks, oh yes, she is drunk. And okay, so then in her like intensity of prayer for this not yet conceived child, she calls out and she cries, and then she has the child, and that's all very good. And we have this other piece, by the way. So okay, they do the human part of conceiving a child, and Hashem. But then God has to do the God part, and God has to remember. And this is another great meaning. The way that haftarahs were selected is always like intensely brilliant, and their liturgical purpose is clear. We see this particularly on fast days. Rav Soloveitchik wrote that actually like the peak piece of the fast day liturgy is the haftarah. The haftarah that we read at Mincha on fast days, that's like in some ways like the most important part of the davening of that day. And I think that's a really beautiful way to see haftarahs in general, that in some ways haftarahs are, I mean, in every way, haftarahs are part of the liturgy, and you're supposed to see them as part of our tefillah, as part of our davening. And I would say that here too, very similarly, and it also just ties in all of these ways. So you have here not just someone crying out in the manner of potentially a shofar, but also you have the zichronot, you have God actually remembering her, and you have that also in the Torah reading. Anyways, okay. And so then you have Hannah davening even more, right? So she sees the high priest, and she says, El hanar azahi palalti, mitena shanli shelati asher sha'alti meimo. I prayed for this boy, and then she says, I'm gonna lend him back to God to serve the Mishkan with you. But tipalel Hannah, and then Hannah opens up and has this like beautiful tefillah that she gives forward. So we've just seen the word in this like one chapter. The word v'tipalel shows up any number of times. She serves as our model of tefillah. And again, what is it? It's this moment of like life and death of will I conceive, will I not conceive, and prayer for and prayers of gratitude then for his conception. And the same thing, basically, you have another woman crying in Rachel, right? And again, the language of Bechi repeats a few times, repeats at least 3 times, right? Nehi bechi tamarim, Rachel mevaka al baneh, min kolach mi bechi, right? So there's just a lot, v'nayach min diman, right? Your eyes from from crying, because she's crying over her sons in hope of their return. And her prayers are ultimately heard, and God responds. Right, your sons, there's reward for your labor. They shall return from the enemy's land. Your children shall return to their country. So not only do we have two cases of women crying when their children are in, or not yet children, or dreamed of children, are in this kind of critical condition of, I can't have children, or my children have been exiled, but then two stories also of their prayers being answered. So that's also very important, that not only is this idea of motherhood, that the mother kind of intercedes on behalf of a child in a vulnerable situation, but also, which is, by the way, to go back to the Moshe as motherhood thing that we started out with, that's kind of what Moshe doesn't want to do, right? Moshe says, like, I didn't understand, like, that I was being put in charge of such a vulnerable group of people that I had to be a mother to them. And here, that's exactly what you're seeing these women doing, all three of them so far that we've seen, right? Sarah crying out over the fact that her son was almost killed by her husband, Hannah crying out over her future child, and Rachel here too, and it's these women crying out over the vulnerable situations of that their children are placed in, and taking responsibility for them. And then in two situations, so not for Sarah, meaning for Sarah, like, had she known, she would have prayed and it already had been answered by the time she calls out. But for Hannah and for Rachel, they're both, Hannah, we see that her prayer is answered, and for Rachel, we have a promise of her prayer being answered. And it ties in nicely to this idea that we see in Bava Metzia. So in Bava Metzia here, we're talking about ona'at dvarim. So we're talking about oppression of other people. And in the Gemara there, it talks about how you have to be particularly careful not to oppress your wife, because here's Rav. Amar Rav, we're in source number 5. Amar Rav, lo lam yehadam zahir ba'ona'at ishto. You have to be super careful not to oppress your wife with words. Shemitoch shedim'ata mitzuya, because she cries easily. Her tear is easily elicited. Ona'ata krova. It's really the punishment for, like, you achieve the level of ona, like the bar is low for violating ona for her. And why is that so bad? So first of all, ona'at dvarim obviously is a Torah violation. But here's Rabbi Elazar jumping into this. Amar Rabbi Elazar, miyom shenacharav Beit HaMikdash nina alu sharei tefillah. He says, from the day that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the gates of prayer are closed, as it says in Eicha gam ki ezak ve'ashaveh satam tefillati. Though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer. And even though the gates of prayer are locked, sharei demaot lo nin alu, the gates of tears are not locked. Shnamar shimat tefillati Hashem v'shavati azina el dimati al tacherash. Hear my prayer, Lord. Give ear to my pleading. Keep not silence on my tears. So first of all, this is just an amazing text. And actually, in our Ne'ilah prayers, we talk about these gates of tears. So look out for those this year at the end of Yom Kippur, because we believe that those gates are still open. And then what the challenge is to cry. But who is like the ultimate kind of crier in almost like a good way in this Gemara? It is wives. It is women. But we've already seen. We saw Hannah cry, we saw Rachel cry, and what happens when they cry? Their cries are answered. So it's not like, oh, those weak women, they cry all the time. Those strong women, they cry all the time, right? Because God answers tears. And so what do your tears accomplish? Literally everything, right? Tears accomplish everything. They accomplish it for Hannah, they accomplish it for Rachel, they accomplish it for the wife in the Talmud, and they will accomplish it for you too. And we have just another source to back this up. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashana says, source number 6. Sorry about that. Source number 6. Rosh Hashana nifkeda Sarah, Rachel, veChana. On Rosh Hashana, Sarah, Rachel, and Chana were all revisited. They were all remembered by God, right? So that's basically the sources we just saw. Hashem Pakadat Sarah, as Kate pointed out, is the Torah reading on the first day. And so here the Gemara is saying they were all remembered and they became pregnant. Imagines the Gemara on this day, which is another, adds a whole new valence to Hayom Harat Olam, right? Like, who got pregnant on Rosh Hashana? Everyone. Sarah Rachel Chana. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Ate Bekidav. Okay, so now I don't know, I think we're going to skip this actually. They go into like these like text, like, how do we learn this from? Oh, you have this word over here and that word over here, like zero chavot, in order to learn that. Anyways, but just trust me, you can, it's here for you. You're welcome to read it on your own, unless you're looking along the screen share, in which case I'm going to scroll past. Anyways, but we have the Gemara also saying, like, Rosh Hashanah connection to these women achieving their goals on this day. Okay. So now we're going to look at a slightly more complicated example, but one that kind of, I think, the complexity of it, I think, really proves the point. Like, there's something very easy about, like, Sarah, Hannah, Rachel. Like, it's easy to look up to them. It's easy to feel inspired by them. I mean, obviously, each in their own way is a very complicated, like, character, and no characters in Tanakh are perfect and all of that, but they're all easy compared to the women we're about to look at. And I'm sure many of our listeners know exactly who we're about to talk about, which is the mother of Sisera. Okay, so but let's like back up a little bit and look at it inside. So we were just talking about this Mishnah before when we saw Sarah only calling out 6 blasts. This is the Mishnah where we know we need to call out 9 blasts. So the Mishnah says, Seder Tekiyot, Shalosh Shal Shalosh Shalosh. So the order of the blast is 3 sets of 3 blasts each, which are Tekiah, Trua, Tekiah. Shiur Tekiah keshalosh truot. So the length of the Tekiah needs to be the length of 3 truot. Shiur Trua keshalosh yevavot. And the length of a Trua is equal to 3 whimpers. Okay, that is like a super halachically complex text, and also like how that plays out in our own like practical shofar blowing, just like as an aside on that. And how the words come to mean this, I'm not going to get into because that's like a little bit too complicated. But it just like you should know. So when you're listening to shofar, you'll know what to listen for. So the Tekiah of each set. So you have a set is 3 blasts. So you have a Tekiah, a Trua, or / a Shvarim / a Shvarim Trua, and then you have another Tekiah. So the Tekiah in a set needs to be the length of the middle thing. So let's say you blow a Tekiah, Shvarim, and then a Tekiah. So that Tekiah at the beginning needs to be as long as the Shvarim is going to be. And similarly, that final Tekiah, which means that when you're blowing a set with a Shvarim Trua, your Tekiah needs to be the length of a Shvarim Trua, which means you need a long Tekiah there. So that's just like what you can listen for. When you, the person who's the Makri, the one who calls out like Tekiah, he's the one in charge of determining whether they were long enough. I just learned today from someone that typically a Shvarim Trua is about 7 seconds, and so the Tekiyahs before and after should be about 7 seconds. So that's just for fun. You know, it's always nice when you're like listening to something. That's not what you should be thinking about when you're listening to shofar, and I'm going to tell you what you should be thinking about. But there's a lot of shofar, so if at some point your mind wanders to, oh, now I know the halacha, you could do worse than that in your mind wandering. And it's good to know just like what's happening in Shul in general. I'm a big believer. Okay, so on to the Gemara. So the Gemara says the length of a trua is equal to 3 whimpers. So quoting the Mishnah, right? So Tanya, we have a Breita shiur trua ke shalosh shvarim. Oh man, I cut out the English here. That's no good. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the Gemara says we have a Breita that the length of the trua is equal to 3 shvarim, which presumably are longer than whatever these yevavot, these whimpers are. Amar Abaye says, Baha vadai pliye. This is for sure what we're debating. K'tiv Yom Trua Yalachem, it says in Bamidbar that this day will be a day of Trua. Mitargaminan, and the Targum on that pasuk in Bamidbar says Yom Yivava Yalechon. It'll be a day of Yivava, this language that we have, Yivavo, whimpering. The K'tiv Be'imei the Sisra, and it says about the mother of Sisra. We find in Shoftim. We'll get to who Sisra is in a second, but the mother of Sisra sat by the window and did Yavava. She whimpered, she cried. So Marsavar Geduche Ganach, Marsavar Ilule Yalia. So one says the sounding, so you have a debate about basically the debate between whether it's a shvarim or whether it's a trua, and one says it's groaning and one says it's whimpering, and that becomes the debate about whether the trua in the Torah is what we would call a trua or what we would call a shvarim, and then you have this compromise opinion of a shvarim trua, which is really just halacha at its best, and that's basically how we get to like what we do for shofar blowing. But I'm interested in this mother of Sisra, because who is Sisra? Sisra sucks. He, in the time of Shoftim, he attacked the Jews, and now we're gonna have two other women. So we're in the song of Devorah. So Devorah sings, she sings a song, and it's this like super military fighter lady song, because she rocks. And actually though, then she like sings about her buddy Yael. So Tivorach minashim Yael, most blessed of women be Yael. She's the wife of Chaver HaKeni. And most blessed of women in the tent, because what does she do in her tent? You might think, oh, women in the tent, like so, so like that's where women belong, whatever. Devorah, you're letting me down. No, because what does Yael do in her tent? So this is about Sisra as the man here. He asked for water, she offered milk. In a princely bowl, she brought him curds. Her left hand then reached for the tent pin, her right for the workman's hammer, and then she struck Sisra, crushed his head, smashed and pierced his temple. Cool. So women in the tents, next time someone tells you to like go home, this is what you should do. And at her feet he sank, lay outstretched. At her feet he sank, lay still, right? That's poetry. And where he sank, there he lay destroyed. Bashar Karasham Nafal Shadud. And then, but in the meanwhile, okay, so that's like seen over here, Yael destroying this guy Sisra, his general, and then like the focus now like shifts back to Sisra's homeland. So if this were like a movie or a TV show, like you'd have like a totally new setting. Okay, and here you have the mother of Sisra. So Ba'ara Chalon Nishkafa V'Tiaviv Aim Sisra, through the window peered Sisra's mother. Behind the lattice she whined. Badashna, I'm sorry, that's behind the lattice. Madua Boshesh Rolavo, why is this chariot taking so long to come? Madua Achero Pa'ame Markavota, why do I not hear the sound of his wheels? And then her ladies in waiting, her wise ladies tell her, and and she also like comes up with all these excuses about where they must be. Oh, they must have won, and they're dividing the spoils, and they're taking all of these. It's kind of funny to like imagine it's like all the stuff her son's gonna bring back for her. He's gonna bring me back dyed cloths and embroidered clothes, and a couple of embroidered clothes around every neck as spoil, and then Devorah, the one who's singing, says, and then we finish off all of Shoftim about Devorah. So Devorah ends her song with, so may all your enemies perish, O Lord, and may his friends be as the sun rising in might. And after this military victory and song, the land was tranquil for 40 years. So this is very interesting that when the Gemara is looking to understand what the Torah means by Yom Teruah Yalachem, they look to none other than Sisra's mother. because we just glorified Sisera's death, right? We raise up Yael, like what a rock star. She killed him so good, right? We said that like 3 times, and with this like really intense description of in her right hand she grabbed at this, and in her left hand she grabbed at that, like just really like glorified description of the death of this man. And the Talmud then says, oh, yeah, so when we're thinking about like what Yom Teruah means, it means what she was doing. It means what the mother of Sisera must have been feeling, which I think is just like really strange. And I am not the first person to wonder about it. So you have, and I should mention, by the way, that that's not the only thing that comes from the mother of Sisera. So the mother of Sisera also gives rise to the following. So here's the Aruch. I mentioned it before. The Aruch says, I mentioned before that the Aruch brings forward this idea of this practice that is common in Hasidic communities, but Rav Soloveitchik was also a big fan, and instituted this in Maimonides. I think at YU, maybe they also do it, that they blow shofar in the silent Amidah. And he says, why do you do it? So the Halin Mahmiri Va'avde Shloshim Kidiyat, so they blow 30 blasts when everyone is sitting, i.e. before the Shemona Esrei. Those are, we call them Tekiyot and Yushav. Shloshim Balachash, 30 during the silent Amidah, V'shloshim al Haseder, and then 30 blasts during the repetition of the Amidah. Keneged, corresponding to Mea Peyot de Pa'e Ime de Sisera, according to the 100 cries that the mother of Sisera cried out. Oh yeah, by the way, that only added up to 90, so that extra 10, so we do that, we blow the extra 10 at the end. For the more like standard Ashkenazi practice that you might be familiar with is that we blow 30 and then 30 throughout the repetition, and then we blow 40 at the end. So that might be more what's familiar to people, but that's not what the Aruch is describing. But what's interesting to me is actually, I mean, that stuff's fascinating, but that's not the point. The point is that we blow 100 because of the mother of Sisera. So we just read together and we saw nowhere that the mother of Sisera cried 100 cries. That's not part of Devorah's explanation of what's happening, or Devorah's not explanation, but description of what's happening. And so here we have the Sefer HaManhig. The Sefer HaManhig is a very interesting work. It was put together by Avram ben Natan, and he's from Lunel, I forgot how to pronounce that. And there's other people who like share his contemporaries of his who have similar names. So he calls himself, you can see here, Ibn Hayarchi, and I'm pretty sure the Yarchi is Lunel, like the place he's from, and then he connects it to the moon, which is what it means, like lunar. Anyways, so that's what he calls himself. He was a wanderer, and what that enabled him to do, and he was just like all over the place, and what that enabled him to do was to actually collect a book of like common practices and write it down. It wasn't printed for a very long time. I mean, obviously when he was writing and, you know, the 1100s and 1200s, there was no printing, but it wasn't printed for a very long time. And that means that all of the printings and manuscripts that the printings are based off of are corrupted. So it's a very useful source, but also it's sometimes like hard to read or understand because it's clearly like missing words or sentences or ideas. But here we have a very early source saying that I heard in Bavel that they have the practice to blow 100 kolot, right? Which means that, by the way, he like didn't have the practice to blow 100 kolot. It wasn't like, oh, everyone blows 100 blasts of the shofar. It's like, oh, I heard that they in Babylon do this, right? So that's just in and of itself kind of interesting. You have guys in medieval Ashkenaz and Sfarad who's saying, telling you about the custom in Babel, and that it wasn't widespread yet. Oh, and I saw it in the Aruch. And then he's going to say, okay, so I found, right, so he says, oh, it connects to, he quotes the Aruch, it connects to the 100 cries of the mother of Sisera. And he says, I found a smach ledavar, I found like a something to like connect it to, a hint of a reason for it, which is from the Midrash. This Midrash appears in a few different places, even within the Tanchuma it appears in a few different places. So he quotes it from the Tanchuma in Amor. It's also the Tanchuma in Tazria, which obviously you'll see in a second why it makes a ton of sense. So Zel Shamar Katuv Hen Atem Ma'ayan Uvlatchem Ma'afat Hoiva Yivchar Behem. So it says, behold, you are nothing, and your work is not an abomination shall he choose among you. So they're going to play like an interesting, it's really not the point, but we'll just go through it. They're going to play like a little bit of word games with it. Henatem ma'yan melicha srucha. So behold, you are nothing. So, okay, you're full of nothing. You're from a putrid liquid. Ufulatchem ma'afa, and then like the ma'afa becomes, the pulatchem ma'afa becomes mimea peiyot sheisha po'a beledata. So that then becomes the 100 screams that a woman screams in her labor. Tzadi tet lemita ve'echad l'chaim. 99 for death and 1 for life. And when she screams out that last 100th scream, that's like the chance that her child has at life. And so this is the part of this that doesn't really make a lot of sense, is how he tries to, is how the Aruch tries to connect this midrash to the screaming of the mother of Sisera. So Tzricha Farish, Sharotzelomar, Kshenit Yashva or Kshenit Yavava, you have to say that when she cries out in Chavlei Yolada, in the suffering of a woman in childbirth, Bola Kiisha Yoshevet al Mashber, her cries came to her like a woman who was sitting on the birthing stool. She cries out like a woman in childbirth. Vishalom ibn Hayarchi. So it's a little bit hard to understand exactly what he means in that last part. It seems to me like he's missing a little piece there, but he's saying, I think what he's getting at, or like my read of it, is that the mother of Sisera, on imagining or understanding why her son was delayed in his return, she reverts back to his mother in the tremendous pain of childbirth, and she cries out in that same way. So any woman who's worried about her children's survival reverts to that like prime moment of, this child coming out of my body, is this child going to survive, where she cries out 99 screams for death and 1 scream for life. So I think what he's trying to do is to connect the psychology of the mother of Sisera in this moment to the woman who's giving birth, and to say that in some ways, when contemplating the potential death of your child, that brings you back to the incredible, both physical, but also in a world where you had a lot of stillbirths, and stillbirths obviously still happen today and are extremely traumatic and scary and difficult, and painful on every level. So that same fear of, is my son still alive? That's the fear that this woman experiences in her childbirth, not knowing whether what's about to come out of her body in this extraordinary pain will be a living child or a dead one. And that the mother of Sisera is tapping back into that moment, and she cries out 100 screams in that very same way. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about one more text, then we'll pause for a couple of questions, and then we'll round this out. So just with the Meshech Chochmah, just on this same subject, we've jumped forward a long time. The Meshech Chochmah passed away in the 1920s, so really quite recent. But he also turns his attention to this connection, and he just adds in. So he's read the man. He sees the connection between the mother of Sisera and the woman who's on the birthing stool. And then he says, he connects it in the Hayom Harat Olam, today, however you want to translate this cryptic line of, today is the birth of the world, today the world is pregnant, today is the pregnancy of the world. And the whole world, he argues, is sitting on the birthing stool, for kindness or for judgment, with your judgment stick, and therefore tokim mea kolo, and therefore we call out 100 blasts. That's like a really amazing interpretation of what's happening. So just to walk you through that, where we've come from the Mishnah of shalosh shal shalosh shalosh again, right? We have the Torah says there will be a day of Trua, and then we have an interpretive issue of what is Trua. The Targum on what is Trua says, we're still in the Gemara. The Targum on what is Trua says Yom Yevava. Okay, so we have this language of Yevava. Who does Yevava? Oh, the mother of Sisra does Yevava. She cries out while she's waiting by the window for her child. And from there, we get to the Aruch who says, and she cried out 100 times. The Manig who says, from where do we know she cried out 100 times? Oh, she's like the woman on the birthing stool, who the Midrash says cries out 100 times. And the Meshech Chochmah says, yes, and on Rosh Hashana, the world is on the birthing stool, and it is crying out 100 times. So that's how we get Em Sisra to what is a Trua, 100 kolot, and to what is happening. The whole world is giving birth on this day. I'm not done and have many more things to say, but I haven't really stopped for questions at all, or comments or feedback of any sort, and that is really not my style. And so I wanted to just like take a breath for a minute and hear any questions or thoughts that people might have. Just I can't, because of my screen share, I can't see everyone, so feel free to just hop in if you have any thoughts or questions.
I'll jump in. I sort of love the way it doesn't really matter who you are. You know, you could be the mother of Sisra, who was a terrible person, and you could be like Hagar, like these women. It really doesn't matter. There's like a universal sense a little bit to what's happening. And it's not just like the founding Avot and Imahot that are impacting the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why I don't think, meaning when you were talking about Slichot last week, I was very specific. I was like, this is about Moshe. And here I'm not like, this is about Hannah or this is about Sisra. I actually think that the move to Sisra, who in some ways is this like really kind of random woman, is a move towards universalism, is a move towards not only could it be anyone, it could even be the mother of your enemy, even someone who like, we're so happy he's dead, right? Like we're gonna glorify his death. But even for her, like she's still a mother. And the point is the motherhood, not who you are or any other piece of your like background or situation. It's like a way of, I think it's a move towards abstraction of the theme, which I think then also enables it to be generalizable to people who will never experience motherhood, because it's not about like the physical having of the child. It's about motherhood as a metaphor, motherhood as a form, as almost a thing that anyone without like physical traits or experiences can take on as a mantle. So we saw Moshe talking about taking it on potentially as a man who wouldn't have experienced motherhood, but I would say for sure that can be expanded to literally anybody, people who are too young to be mothers, or people who, you know, never had that experience for whatever reason, whether that's totally fine for them or sad for them or anything else, like that this is an experience that can be tapped into, and we use motherhood and these specific women as almost like metaphors for it, or as ways to tap into it, but it's actually a little bit more conceptual than any like specific woman or experience.
I have a comment and I have a question.
Yeah, thanks. Go.
So my comment is that it seems like in my head, the shot of Shoshim, which I've seen like many times, thank God, in my life, but in my head it like ended with Sister's mother crying, and that was the source for Shofar. But that's actually not what it is. It's this more like doubtful, like I don't know what's happening, sort of tentative thing. And I was struck by the sort of like potentiality. We don't know. Like I feel kind of bad about things, but it could still be okay. Like we're going to tell ourselves a story. And the sort of interaction with that of the crying out of the woman who's giving birth as like, we don't know what's going to happen yet. And like thinking about that on Rosh Hashana and like that as an overlap. That's my comment.
Yeah.
So
And I think, just to respond to that for a second, that's why I think in some ways Sarah is the worst of the examples. Everyone else, I could have brought Hagar onto here also, and I'm so glad that Kate mentioned her, and who was just talking? Yael, right? Yael just mentioned her now. And because she actually is also in the camp of, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, my child is in this vulnerable state, and it could go either way, which we saw with Sisera, because she doesn't know yet. We know, but she doesn't know, which we see with Hannah, with her like not yet child, which we see with Rachel and her future, obviously, children. But Sarah already knows the outcome. So in some ways, she's the worst example, even though she would obviously be the most kind of straightforward of the examples if otherwise. Yeah. Okay, we got your question.
So my question is, I feel like when we talked about Moshe last week, I came out with a very clear picture of like, here's what it means to think of myself as Moshe when I'm davening. Like, it gives you certain sort of like footing and chutzpah and like confidence. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more for those of us who aren't mothers or aren't yet mothers, like what you see, like being able to read ourselves into these images, like brings to our, like ought to bring to our tefillah experience.
Great. So that is exactly where I wanted to go next. So with all of your permission, I'm going to stop answering questions now and answer Abigail's question and then wrap up. And then if we have more minutes, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit and answer other questions. Okay. So exactly as Abigail mentioned, I am quite invested in leaving you with a way to kind of read yourself into this. So the first thing I want to say on that is, I want to say that the blowing of the shofar, and this is why I think Sisera, and I brought that midrash for Sarah, because you have Sarah as the beginning of you have Sarah as kind of the initiator of shofar. Then you have shofar being modeled on the mother of Sisera. You have all these women crying in the same way that you have Sisera's mother crying. And we saw that Gemara in Bava Metzia about how when people cry, their cries are answered. And so the shofar, as we see it very explicitly from Sarah and the mother of Sisera, is the cry of the mother. Okay, great. So what is that? So what does it mean to read yourself into that? So first of all, I think it means to do almost the opposite of what we saw Moshe doing. Moshe says, I'm not these people's mother. I think on Rosh Hashana, we're saying, I'm these people's mother. And the whole world is in the vulnerable state. When we say Hayom Harat Olam, read in, which comes right after Shofar, read into it the Meshech Chochmah, who is saying the whole world is on the birthing stool right now. And we, in blowing Shofar, are calling out in the vulnerability of that world. We're in a situation, a precarious, vulnerable situation, where the world could be judged for good or the world could be judged for bad. Never in my lifetime, a relatively short lifetime, has that felt more real than this year. And we'll leave the commentary on that for another time. But it feels, right, the world feels very precarious. And really that it could go in so many different ways, and that instead of this move of, did I give birth to this world? Which, like, that, that we could say that, but the shofar calls us and reminds us to do what a mother needs to do, which is to take responsibility, to keep moving forward, and to cry out in the cries of Rachel, and the cries of the mother of Sisera, and the cries of Hannah, and the cries of Hagar, and the cries of Sarah, and say, yes, like, I care, I'm not walking away from this responsibility, and I believe that my cries are a form of prayer, and my cries will be answered because the gates of cries are open. And so what it means, and just to, like, Abigail asked me to kind of maybe like reflect for as a mother of 4.5 months, I feel like rather unqualified to say, like, this is what motherhood is about. But at the same time, like, the early days of motherhood, as you might know just from like literature or talking to friends, are like absolutely brutal, because you have a child who is incapable of anything and cries all the time, and your job is to guess what they want and provide it to them whenever they want it, whether or not you've gotten any sleep in the last like 4 weeks or not. And the child is totally helpless, even to the extent of many children are not like are not good at feeding themselves, are not good at eating, right? You think like, oh, babies are born, the only thing they know how to do is to suck. Well, like a lot of babies are really bad at that even. Like they're not even capable of helping themselves to get the only thing they need, which is food. And they're not even capable of falling asleep, which is the other thing they need, because they need food and sleep and to, you know, poop and stuff. And that's basically it, right? And they're not capable of getting those primary things. They're so intensely vulnerable and they cry out. And they're like really, really annoying in their crying out. And we still like care for them. And even though they're like literally torture us because we haven't slept in a month, okay? And even though through that torture, we continue to provide for them, even I know so many mothers, myself certainly included, who like your baby is crying and like you're also crying and like everyone is crying together, and yet somehow there's something like I think Rosh Hashana is helping me kind of like come to terms with, thank God, those memories of the first month of my son's life, and to say that those cries and crying while you yourself are also answering the cry, that there's something like very intense about that moment, that in saying I am taking responsibility for this incredibly vulnerable being, that being is crying out and I am crying in response to its cries, and together those cries will be answered. And so what I wanted to summarize what I just said, which I think was maybe a little bit winding, and then we definitely in the last 2 minutes need to get to this last source because I think it's really kind of the cherry on top, is it's about like intense empathy and responsibility through pushing through exasperation at all of it, and the reason why that last piece is important is because similar to last week where we're asking something very specific from God, I think with and we're asking God to kind of meld into the thing that we're trying to be, right? We saw Moshe and God kind of melding and crying out, God crying out to God's self. So here we're gonna see the same thing, with God crying out on behalf of God's children. So here we have Rabbi Yossi. This is a quite beloved passage. We have Rabbi Yossi who said, "Pam achad hayiti mahalich b'derech v'nichnasi l'chorba achad michorvot Yerushalayim leipalel." I was going on the way and I entered into a ruin, amongst the ruins of Jerusalem to pray, and Elijah came and he guarded the door. Okay. And Elijah, after he finished praying, Elijah asks Rabbi Yossi, Amar li b'ni ma kol shamata b'chorba zeh. He says, my son, what did you hear in this ruin? V'amarti lo shamati bat kol shemenahemet k'yonah. I heard a heavenly voice cooing like a dove and crying out, omeret, and saying, Oy levanim shavnotem acharavti et biti v'sarafti et heichali v'higalitim levina umot. Woe to the children due to whose sins I destroyed my house, burned my temple, and exiled among the nations. Amar li, Elijah responded, Chayecha v'chayei roshecha lo sha'azu bilvad omeret kach ela b'chol yom v'yom shalosh pa'amim omeret kach. Not just, Elijah says, by your life and your head, not just this time does God cry out like this, or does the heavenly voice cry out like this. Rather, every day, 3 times a day, the heavenly voice cries out. And cries out how? Cries out for God's children. So this, I would argue, is an act of motherhood on behalf of God. God here is in some ways like mimicking Rachel crying out for her sons, crying out for their exile. Here you have God too crying out for God for God's exiled children. And so I think not only is the shofar carrying echoes of the cries of the mother of Sisera and the cries of Sarah, the shofar also then encourages us to step into motherhood, and hopefully also then encourages God to remember that God too cries out over the precarious, vulnerable situation that God self has put his children into. And hopefully then, along with our tears and our cries and our shofar blasts, God will hear God's own cries, and answer them in that very same way, because the doors of cries are open. And so I guess I'll just wrap up to say, I hope you all have a beautiful, happy, and healthy New Year. And I hope that when you hear the shofar, this is something I actually often recommend to people before shofar. Scream along with the shofar, like inside your head, not outside. But like when you hear the shofar being blown, like scream inside your body, inside your head with the shofar. It's extremely powerful in my experience, and it really enables you to experience the shofar as a cry, almost this like wordless, intense, primordial prayer of the mother on the birthing stool crying out 99 times for death and 1 time for life, as she sits not knowing what's about to emerge out of her very own body, whether for life or for death. And with that same like fear of the future, but responsibility for the vulnerability that the world carries. I hope that we can all take extremely seriously and also step into the role that the shofar demands of us, asks of us in just a few days' time. So Shana Tova. And happy davening.
Thank you very much. I do just want to note, as Rabbanit Sarna said, folks are welcome to stick around if they have a few more questions, but I do also want to quickly note that for anyone who's interested, obviously we hope to see you all next week for the last installment of this series, but we also have a number of other classes that we are offering through Drisha Online. You can get information about those at drisha.org/classes. For things that are going on the rest of this week, as well as during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, including our annual Stanley Rudolph Memorial High Holidays lecture tomorrow at 1 p.m. Does the Book of Tehillim Tell a Story with Dr. Yael Ziegler. Information will be coming out, God willing, in the next couple of weeks about our classes post-Chagim, but we will have a full slate of things, including more classes with Rabbanit Sarna. So please do keep an eye on our website for all of that. But yeah, questions are welcome if folks have the last few things. But yeah, Shana Tova, thank you all so much for being here.